Hey everybody, Mr. Kowalczyk here. We're going to go through Geometry Unit 8, Lesson 3 about congruent corresponding parts. Corresponding, another way to think about corresponding is matching or partnering. But today we're going to talk about that. Standard 12.4, typo. I can use the definition of congruent triangles to show corresponding parts of triangles are congruent. Let's talk about what that means here. Again, we've got a QR code for extra help if you need it. Given the congruency statement, triangle ABC congruent to triangle XYZ, list out all the corresponding angles and corresponding segments. So for example, we have angle A and angle X, and segment AB and segment XY. See if you can come up with as many congruency statements from this as possible. Okay, so what we can do is we can see that angle A is going to match up with angle X based on the order. Angle B is going to match up with angle Y. And angle C is going to match up with angle Z. So we know those are going to match up with each other. Now we can also see that AB and XY, so AB, the first two letters, correspond to the first two letters in this one. So then that tells us that the second two letters will also correspond, BC and YZ. So BC and YZ match up with each other. And then the letters on the first and third are the other pairs that we haven't had yet. So X and Z correspond to A and C. And that's all of them. Those are all 6 congruency statements or corresponding segments and angles that we can come up with for this particular opener. All right, let's jump down to our notes here. Congruent figures and corresponding parts. Now, congruent figures, remember, they're exactly the same, so we can describe them as having the same size and shape. Corresponding parts are in the same relative position. So that means that they're going to be in the exact same position in each figure. All right, given the diagram to the right and the fact that triangle JMK is congruent to triangle PRQ, what are the corresponding sides and angles? So if we look at this, we can see that each of these triangles are congruent to each other by several different shortcuts. That's easy to prove because everything here is labeled as being congruent, all the sides and all the angles. So let's go ahead and make some congruency statements. So I'm going to start with the angles. One tick mark here, one tick mark here. Angle J is congruent to angle P. Angle M is congruent to angle R. And angle K is congruent to angle Q. So those are all 3 congruency statements for the angles. Now let's talk about the sides. One tick mark for JM and PR. JM is congruent to segment PR. They're in the same relative position between the one angle and the two angle. One angle and two angle. Now we have 2 tick marks here, so MK and RQ are also going to be congruent to each other. MK is congruent to RQ. And then finally we have KJ and QP. KJ is congruent to QP. So this side over here is the long side opposite the obtuse. The long side opposite the obtuse. Right, so we have JK being congruent to PQ because they're in the same relative position. Right, they're in the same position of the triangle, and we can determine that as well. It takes us down to our final rule for today, is that congruent figures have congruent corresponding parts. So if they're congruent, the corresponding parts, the parts that match up with each other, whether they be the sides or the angles, they're going to be congruent to each other. This is abbreviated as CPC. Cpctc. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. If this abbreviation helps you, great. If it doesn't, just know what it stands for. All right, let's do some practice problems here. Let's check out number 1. This picture here is the rear end of a spy plane called the SR-71 Blackbird. And we can see that the rear wings of this plane suggest coarse congruent triangles. So we're being asked to solve for the measure of angle D. Well, if we zoom in on it, we can see that angle B and angle E are congruent. So we know that they're both going to be 30 degrees. Here we have 75 degrees. Well, we know that 30 plus 75 plus this one angle here has to equal 180. So we have 30 plus 75 divided, because all three angles in a triangle equal 180, right? So we know 30 plus 75 is going to equal 105. And then if we take 180 and we subtract 105 from that, that's going to give us 75 degrees. So that tells us that 75 degrees is our third angle here in this triangle. So we have 75 both base angles and 30 up here. Now, why is that important? Well, we know from our definition from before that the corresponding angles that match up in each triangle are going to be the same. So we can see visually that this angle A here is going to be congruent to this angle D here, which is the one that we're trying to solve for. So because A is equal to 75 degrees, we can also say that the measure of angle D is equal to 75 degrees, because the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are going to be congruent, the same as each other. All right, let's go down to number 5. Okay. So here we have our congruency statement that says triangle LMN is congruent to triangle LYZ. So we have triangle LMN being congruent to LYZ. And the question says angle N is congruent to what? Well, we can figure this out a couple different ways. The first way we could do it is we could look at the congruency statement. And we could see what angle does angle N correspond to. Well, in this situation, N is the third letter in this congruency statement on this side for this triangle. So we know that's going to correspond to the third letter in the other triangle in the congruency statement. So we can say that that's congruent to angle Z. Another way we can look at it is visually. What do the triangles look like? Where does it look like angle N, based on the shape of this triangle, can we accurately determine based on which of this triangle it's going to be congruent to? It's a little bit hard to tell because this angle and this angle, it's hard to tell whether or not they're kind of, which one is more accurate. Like this one is acute and that one's acute, but it's kind of hard to tell. So what I would do is I would look at the number of arcs in angle N. And here I have 1, 2, 3 arcs there. So I know that's going to be congruent to this angle over here with 1, 2, 3 arcs there. And finally, the third way that I can prove this to myself is by looking at my landmarks. Here I have 3 tick marks, and on the other side of angle N, I have 2 tick marks. So what I want to do in my other triangle is look for where those 3 tick marks are, and how does that correspond to the 2 tick marks? What angle is between those two? And that's going to be angle Z. So there's a couple different ways that you can figure out which angle corresponds and is congruent to angle N in this particular situation. So I just wanted to show you all of those so you could figure out which one made the most sense to you. All right, let's go over to number 2. And number 2 says triangle DBC is congruent to triangle DRT. DBC is congruent to DRT. Awesome. Okay. Now, the question says DB is going to be congruent to what? Well, again, let's go through the same process. We see that DB are the first 2 letters. That's going to be congruent to DR, the first 2 letters in the other statement. Segment DR. Remember to include your segment notation up above. Okay. Now let's check it visually. Segment DB has 1 tick mark. Segment DR has 1 tick mark. We can prove those together. Another way we can look at our landmarks again. We have 1 tick mark here, and on the other side of DB, we have 2 tick marks. One tick mark for the angle here, 2 tick marks for the angle there. So it's got to be side DR. So we can use these tick marks, we can use our angle tick marks, or we can use our congruency statement to figure out which one corresponds here. Okay. All right, let's jump in. We'll do number 8. Okay. Now, number 8, the instruction said mark the angles inside of each pair of triangles to indicate that they are congruent. So here we have QRP is congruent to QGH. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I see that angle Q and angle Q are the same. They're going to be congruent to each other. And that means right here. Now, obviously, we can't call this angle angle Q, but we know that it's angle Q at this point for each triangle. Now, we can't call it angle Q because there's more than one angle here, but for the purposes of our congruency statement, we can say that this is going to be congruent to this angle right here. This one we would call PQR. This one we would call HQG. Yeah? All right, now let's go back to our congruency statement. Angle R is going to be congruent to angle G. So angle R, I'm going to put 2 tick marks there, and I'm going to put 2 tick marks up here for angle G. So those are congruent, and that just leaves us with angle P and angle H. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now let's figure out our sides. We did the angles, now we need to do the sides. QR, first 2 letters, is going to be congruent to QG. So QR, I'm going to put 1 tick mark there. QG, 1 tick mark there. Awesome. Now we have RP. That's going to match up to GH. RP is down here, so let's give that 2 tick marks. GH is up here, 2 tick marks there. That leaves us with our last one. We have 1, 2, 3 tick marks for QP, and 1, 2, 3 tick marks to QH. Awesome. Done. Last one, last sample problem. Let's look at number 12. Okay, number 12 through 19 each have 7 answers. 1 triangle congruency statement, 3 angle congruency statements, and 3 side congruency statements. So first thing we need to do is write our triangle congruency statement, because that's really going to help us out. Now again, I'm going to start out with my landmarks. I'm going to look at my angles, and that's going to help me out tremendously. Here I have 1 tick mark, here I have 2, and here I have 3. So I'm just going to go in order, 1, 2, 3. That's going to be the easiest way for me to remember. So triangle ELM is congruent to, let's look up here, 1 tick mark, 2 tick marks, and 3 tick marks, EFG. Triangle EFG. So there I go, I have my first answer. Now I need to jump in and write my 6 other correct answers. So that all 3 angles, E and E, are going to match up, but I can't call them angle E. I have to call them, because there's 2 angles here, GEF. Angle GEF is congruent to MEL. Angle MEL. All right, now 2 tick marks. L is going to correspond to F. Angle L is congruent to angle F. And I can call them angle L and angle F because there's only 1 angle here at point L. Same thing with point F. But here in the center, where these 2 angles intersect, the 2 triangles share the same vertex. I can't do that. And then I have angle M and angle G. Angle M is congruent to angle G. All right, so now I have 4 answers, and I need my 3 more congruency statements for my sides. So let's do the same thing. 1 tick mark, 2 tick marks, 3 tick marks. EL, 1 tick mark, FE. Okay, 2 tick marks, LM is congruent to FG. And finally, GE is congruent to ME. Awesome. All right, so now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 answers. I've got 1 triangle congruency statement, 3 angle statements, and 3 side statements. Got that correct. Okay, fantastic. All right, hope that was helpful. We'll finish up the rest of the incompleted or uncompleted practice problems in class next time. Have a great night. Hope this was helpful.